Connecticut became the 19th state to legalize marijuana for recreational use back in the summer of 2021. A year and a half later, in tandem with the launch of recreational cannabis sales, thousands of Connecticut residents have had low-level cannabis possession charges erased from their records. Many aspects of the recreational marijuana launch in Connecticut, including the erasure of cannabis convictions, they were really designed to reverse the disproportionate impact the war on drugs has had on people of color, to allow Connecticut residents with old convictions on their records a shot at overcoming barriers to employment and housing. But the late implementation of the state's clean slate law has hundreds of thousands of people with other low-level convictions waiting for their chance. They could be waiting throughout 2023. Today on Where We Live, we'll discuss the holdup on criminal record expungement with several area journalists, and we'll take a big-picture look at Connecticut's recreational rollout. Joining me now to discuss first, Jaden Edison, the justice reporter for the Connecticut Mirror. Good morning, Jaden.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
John Craven, News 12 political reporter. Good morning, John.
Morning, Frankie.
And Natalie Ferdig, who is the federal cannabis policy reporter for Politico. Good morning, Natalie.
Hey.
And if you're listening, you can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. This hour, we ask you, how's Connecticut doing on the rollout of recreational marijuana? 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Jaden, I want to talk to you first. I want to ask you, criminal records erasure for low-level marijuana possession proved under the state's recreational cannabis law. On New Year's Day, some 44,000 convictions were automatically erased. Why is that so critical, Jaden?
Well, it is critical. You know, when you talk about, as you mentioned, the disproportionate impact that the war on drugs and the criminalization of essentially, you know, what are now have been considered drug offenses, the effect that has had on predominantly Black and brown people, you know, in this country, Connecticut being no stranger to that, I think it's huge. You know, I think, you know, when you look at the big picture, though, when it comes to clean slate, in the particular in the 44,000, you know, people who've had their records expunged, to know that there are 100,000 more who are essentially waiting to be in that same category, right? To be able to have an opportunity to attain housing and to, attain, an education and, attain jobs, right? Like these are all things that tie into the bigger picture, that all are relevant to the greater conversation when we're talking about, those expungements.
John Craven, News 12 political reporter. We just talked about the clean slate law. What's exactly in that? And were these 44,000 convictions covered in that?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of confusion there, and it's understandable, but there are actually two different pieces of legislation we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So the cannabis erasures were part of the cannabis legalization law that passed in 2021. There was a separate bill that advocates had been pushing for a long time, called the Clean Slate Law. And there was some back and forth between criminal justice advocates and progressive Democrats and Governor Lamont about how far that law was going to go. Initially, it included a lot more, lower level felony convictions. It still includes some, but at the governor's pushing, they really pared that down. Now, so the 44,000 cannabis convictions that were erased, the Lamont administration says that was fairly straightforward because the cannabis law, the legalization law, pretty well clearly spells out, X, Y, and Z get automatically deleted. And then there are some other convictions that people can apply to get erased. The clean slate law is a lot broader, and from what the Lamont administration has said, there are technological computer processing issues that go into and some of these convictions almost have to be I guess sort of manually gone through to see if they qualify. That's what we've told is the holdup with that, but they are actually two separate pieces of legislation.
State saying that it's going to cost $5 million for technology upgrades to update whatever the judicial branch records are to account for some of these. Jaden, what are you hearing about, what John Craven's talking about with these technology upgrades, but also the fact that maybe they need to work through some things in the legislature. Who kind of qualifies in clean slate as you understand it, or who may qualify?
Right. So clean slate essentially would automatic. So there's two parts to it, right? You have the automatic erasure part of it, which essentially will erase the criminal records of people 7 years after the date of their conviction for a misdemeanor or 10 years after their conviction for a certain low level felony. So there's that part. And then the second part is that there is no automatic erasure if there were convictions on or prior to January 1st, 2000. So if someone falls into that category, right, they would have to petition the court to essentially have their record, erased. And so this is all, it's a part of this bigger conversation, right? Because when we talk about the delay and you talk about, the price tag associated with technology upgrades and et cetera, Clean Slate was essentially, it was signed in June 2021. And the idea was that you would have an entire year to be able to work out the kinks of, okay, we need money toward this, or hey, let's figure out how to work this system, right before full implementation on January 1st of this year. But I think a lot of frustration has sort of, come to the forefront because, news around this delay didn't come until just a few short weeks before Clean Slate was slated to be fully implemented. And so there's a lot of parts to it, but when it comes to the technicalities of it, there is the automatic erasure part. And then, like, as I mentioned before, there are people who will have to petition the court if they do want to be considered for criminal have their records erased or expunged.
The petition process happens online at a state portal website, and we'll give you that in a moment. But there's that process where these folks will be able to petition. The website's live, but that doesn't mean you can petition yet. And even before that, John Craven, State Senator Gary Winfield says we haven't nailed that down in terms of what legislation needs to be passed to clean up Clean Slate. So it sounds like, John Craven, there's going to be some rankling over this bill at the legislative level.
Yeah, and I think, again, part of the problem is that the governor wasn't really on board with how far it went either. I mean, he didn't really commit to signing this legislation until the last minute. And even when he signed it, he expressed reservations about, how far some of the felony convictions went. So I think, I think you're going to see some Republicans and maybe even some moderate Democrats in the legislature, maybe want to revisit some of those. I mean, obviously, public safety has been a huge topic since the pandemic started, and there are a lot of reasons why crime spiked briefly in 2020 and 2021. But I think it's still an issue that a lot of voters think about. And I think that there are going to be lawmakers who want to capitalize on that and say, you know what, maybe it's not so safe to be erasing certain felonies. How far that gets in the legislature this year, I don't see it really getting that far, but I think the discussion will come up.
Jaden, we're both at a news conference recently in Hartford where Winfield and the state's Undersecretary for Criminal Justice, Mark Pelka, addressed the delays. You at that news conference asked him about the 250, maybe 280,000 convictions left to be cleared. What are advocates saying in response to the Clean Slate delay?
I think there's real frustration, right? I mean, when you look at the timeline, as John just mentioned, I mean, this bill was essentially signed in 2021. So, and at the time, right, you had Governor Lamont, who really pushed for a tapered list of eligible crimes for erasure during the entire negotiation period when it came to Clean Slate. So you already had the governor, as John just mentioned, who seemingly a little reluctant and there was some uncertainty about if he, fully supported the bill and whatnot. And so over the course of the last year, right, I mean, we've seen Governor Lamont on the campaign trail, right? In October, he had he still with, Republican gubernatorial candidate Bob Stefanowski, and they spoke about Clean Slate, right? And it seemed as if everything was sort of in place to everything was ready to go into motion. But then just a few weeks before December, and for advocates, it was just a few weeks before that, around the Thanksgiving holiday, you hear that, there won't be essentially full implementation for the just short of 300,000 people when it comes to the clean slate. And so I think there's real frustration, to answer your question. And, I'm on a bunch of these calls, and I talk to folks within the justice community on a routine basis. And I do think this is a part of a larger trend of people who do this work who don't feel that Governor Lamont and his administration champions the things that are important to them, champions and supports, people who are behind bars, or people who have, who are no longer incarcerated, right, but still suffer the consequences, as most of the folks under clean slate. That's what the law is targeted to do. And so back to the simple part of your question is, there's just real frustration, and I think there's a desire for more transparency when it comes to this administration.
And Jaden, it sounds like there may be a tipping point later this year when there is full implementation, if there is full implementation, because Pelka, who I mentioned earlier is the state's undersecretary for criminal justice, he tells me it's more like you're reporting in the study that you allude to as 250, maybe 280,000 convictions left to be cleared. Pelka says it's more like 50,000 on top of the 44,000 convictions they already cleared. Where's the discrepancy?
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? And I think that is part of the frustration when it comes to advocates. It's like what we're hearing publicly. I mean, you've had officials, chairs of the Judiciary Committee in the legislature who've talked about this number of around 300,000 people who would benefit from clean slate. So there are discrepancies there. But when you look at it, right, you've had Governor Lamont in the last week who's publicly gone on record and said, hey, we're going to get this thing passed in the next 6 to 12 months, who essentially guaranteed and said on the record at that press conference that you and I both attended that clean slate would be fully implemented at some point in 2023, probably the second half of 2023. So again, it just goes back to the miscommunication or the discrepancies in what we're hearing. When it comes down to it, though, where you go back and look at some of that public testimony during that time, this bill would help a lot of people. There are people who testified, and I think the general consensus was that, when people have access to jobs, when they have access to housing, when they have access to education, right, they are more likely to earn higher wages and they're less likely to recidivate, right? And I think the studies and research backs that up. There was the study out of Michigan, from the University of Michigan, found that people who obtain expungement experience have a sharp upturn in their wage and employment. So we're talking about full implementation would truly help. And when you talk about the racial wealth gap, you talk about disparities and all these things, and how Black and brown people are predominantly affected, by, felony conviction, et cetera, et cetera. There's just real, frustration, real anticipation on one end and hope that this thing is going to get through. And on the other end, just, again, outright frustration in the miscommunication and the disparities in what we're hearing from officials.
And Frankie, I'll just jump in real quick. You asked about tweaks that might happen to the law. I think the thing you might be more likely to see this session is some clarification about what exactly qualifies and what doesn't, and how certain cases should be treated in terms of processing that for erasure. You guys probably remember when this news broke, just before New Year's, that the automatic erasure wasn't going to happen on January 1. There was a letter that the state court system sent to the legislature saying, we have X, Y, and Z questions, essentially data processing questions about, how to implement this law. So I think there are some parts of the law that might need to be tightened up, and hopefully that will address some of the disparity in the numbers that we're seeing if they can really tighten down the legislative language. I think Gary Winfield, the Senate Judiciary Chair, really is sort of aiming to do that this session.
Access to jobs and education, as Jaden had mentioned earlier, and Beth Hines, who's with Community Partners in Action. This is a local organization that tries to connect people that come out of prison to any kind of resource, a ride or a job. That says that when you have a conviction off your record, now when you go and apply for housing or something like that, the person that applies next to you won't have that advantage over you, won't have a conviction. You'll have a conviction and that person won't. So that'll be a great thing about this whole thing. Natalie Ferdig is the federal cannabis policy reporter for Politico. Natalie, Why historically do we need to now look at not necessarily? I know historically is always a scary word in it, and it conjures up like maybe a long response. But why is it so important to consider decriminalizing cannabis when we talk about legalizing cannabis? Not necessarily just the fact that we've decriminalized it, but what are we reversing here? What's historically happened to stigmatize cannabis here?
Oh man, I mean, you're right. That's a very long answer. I mean, we know from the history of cannabis criminalization in the United States that it's been used specifically and intentionally to target Black and Brown communities. I mean, the ACLU puts out data regularly and shows that there are still, even in states that have legalized cannabis, where criminal activity has decreased dramatically on cannabis, still the small sections where people are still being arrested for something like that, the discrepancies between white people who are arrested and Black and Brown people who are arrested still exist in those states. So there's, something that I've noticed covering this for the last 4 years is that lawmakers and the general public tend to look at cannabis in a vacuum, when really cannabis is just part of the larger system. So if there's arrest discrepancies and in a state, it's not going to go away because you legalize cannabis. But undoing those discrepancies is obviously giving people a leg up who had not been given one for so long. And so that's why so many states, and actually the East, this is kind of the thing that the East is actually leading in cannabis, because Colorado, Washington, Oregon, California did not do this in the mid 2010s when they were legalizing, because at the time it was sort of like a bridge too far for local voters and lawmakers to blanketly expunge records. And now that Illinois, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts have started to do this, Western states are actually going back and saying, should we also do this? And what are the models that the Eastern states are doing that we can look at, either to improve upon or to say this worked in this place and we're going to do it. So yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting sort of, the West tossed the weed ball to the East Coast. The East Coast said we're going to add to it and is now tossing it back.
Wonderful. Oh my God, that was a great conversation. I'm so sorry there, Natalie, to ask you such a broad question, but it's important to understand that history and what happened around the early 80s, maybe 1982, when the Reagans and the White House declares essentially a war on drugs and how it had impact. Folks, if you're listening right now, you can give us a call, 1-888-720-WNPR, if you want to join in on this conversation. We talked about passing the weed ball from the West Coast essentially to the East. Who's the model here, Natalie, for, this is my last question for the segment here. Natalie, who's the model here for maybe an Eastern state or something like that? Connecticut, it sounds like, is doing well in this regard, but maybe it's some other state that is the model for kind of folding in expungement into the recreational rollout. Who would you say is the model?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there's not really enough years out yet to say this state really, it worked and it was successful, because obviously expungements are going to take time. But I think a lot of people are looking at Illinois, frankly. They did a blanket expungement. Something that I've noticed in looking at states that have done expungements is when people have to apply for the expungements, that tends to make them not accessible for some people. Some people never get the memo. They don't have the resources to go through the application process. They fill out the applications wrong. There's just sort of, it creates a benchmark for people to have to hit to be able to get those expungements. So Illinois did not do that. They partnered with a nonprofit organization called Code for America, and they developed a computer program that just expunged all cannabis records of a specific type. Back to the idea that cannabis works within the systems that already exist. I think expungements are a great example of this. A lot of states have said, oh, we've got a great idea. Let's expunge these cannabis records. And then gotten into the criminal justice system and realized, like Jaden and John were talking about, they need to get records online. And these are issues that people that are in the criminal justice system have been meeting with for decades, right? The barriers for them, if say they had a record that after so many years was going to be sealed or expunged, the criminal justice system sometimes leaves them out and forgets to do those things. And so cannabis is sort of shining a light or highlighting parts of these systems that have always existed and a lot of people have never paid attention to. And saying, oh, wow, this is messed up. We actually need to do a lot more work to fix these things than we thought we did.
Political reporter Natalie Furtick, stick around. News 12's John Craven, stick around as well. Thank you guys so much for this conversation. Jaden Edison, we're going to say goodbye to you. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about really the important work of cannabis conviction erasure.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Jaden Edison is with the Connecticut Mirror. Thank you, Jaden. We'll continue this conversation right after the break. You can join us, 888-720-9677. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano, and back with me to dig into all things recreational marijuana and what's ahead for Connecticut. I've got John Craven from News 12 News 12. He's a political reporter there. And I've got Natalie Furtick, who's a federal cannabis policy reporter for Politico. Natalie, I'm so immature that every time I think about cannabis, I think about somebody asking for a puff of a cannabis cigarette or something like that. Some people I knew back in the day wouldn't use the word cannabis. Help me. When you're doing your writing and your reporting, what are some other terms we can use here for marijuana, or to sound maybe more natural? Because it's been stigmatized so much in the past that we have to use these words. But help me with some other terms here.
Yeah. So, I mean, weed, I use the word weed a lot. I think it's a pretty common colloquialism. I know that some advocates I talk to like to stay away from the term for pot. They think that it has more of a stigma to it. But I do want to, kind of point out, I cover politics and policy specifically. So I have to use the word marijuana because cannabis includes both marijuana and hemp. And I think that's something that people miss. I actually get people on Twitter yelling at me about it a lot. But marijuana, per the federal government, is cannabis with more than 0.3% THC. And hemp is cannabis with less than 0.3% THC. Scientists would not agree with that. Botanists would not agree with that. But that's the federal government's definition. So I think when we're writing, you see a lot of people writing about marijuana, cannabis, hemp, using these words interchangeably. It's pretty confusing for people, but that's what's going on. Cannabis is both, but hemp and marijuana are separate.
God, I appreciate that cannabis education so very much. Thank you for that, Natalie. And if folks want to join in on the conversation with us, they can call 888-720-9677. It's a good conversation. And I just want to say that 2 medical dispensaries have been tapped for the adult use recreational cannabis rollout. Connecticut licensed 9 of them to sell recreational pot here, but only 7 of them were permitted to go last Tuesday when the state launched recreational marijuana sales. According to the Department of Consumer Protection, 7 shops made $359,130 on opening day. John, is that high? Is that low? What do we know?
Well, we'll excuse the pun, high. I'm hearing that it's really low compared to what Massachusetts was pulling in just in their first few days. But keep in mind that, this is a pretty limited rollout, and it was designed that way on purpose. I mean, like you mentioned, 9 dispensaries have the state licensing to start doing retail sales. Only 7 of them, were finished building out and getting all the, I think, local stuff sewn up that they needed to do. So we only have 7 places throughout the state. They're fairly small limits on what people can buy. It's a quarter of an ounce, which per transaction, which comes out to I think 10 to 14 pre-rolls, or and I think
7 to
edibles.
14 pre-rolls. Yeah, you got it. You got it. You know your measurements. Go ahead.
I've reported it so much.
2 cartridges.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, so I mean, those are modest amounts for a recreational user, but I think I think that again, it's sort of a soft launch. The selection, the dispensaries tell me, isn't great. Some of them only got gummies literally the day before retail sales launched. I think others of them still hadn't got them yet. And part of that is because this stuff has to be completely produced in state. And keep in mind that Connecticut has only grown for medical purposes for the last couple of years. And so all these products that are coming online for recreational use, there has to be a whole production industry that comes up around that.
Mm-hmm.
The licensing process with DCP has been, somewhat slow. I'm sure we'll talk about that. And so I think the product offerings have yet to catch up. Whereas, if you look at a state like Massachusetts, I think they got off the ground a little faster, and obviously they have a much larger product selection.
I hear what you're saying in this conversation, because for the purposes of this conversation, I went to a local marijuana website here and saw what their gummy offering was, and it looked like the 2 things that they offered were these like cough drop looking things that were, I guess, strawberry and grape flavor. Not the most appetizing, but it seems like they only had 2 items too, versus they had 80 of one product of the flower, and I think there was like something like 50, 60 of the pre-rolls. So not a big offering yet on the gummies. Hey, John's talking about a comparison to Massachusetts. I saw that back in 2018, Natalie, Massachusetts did $440,000 on its first day of business in the state selling weed for recreational use. I got that from Boston.com. Was that a lot of money, Natalie? Can you offer us any kind of points of comparison here? We have 2 numbers so far. We have Connecticut's 359K number and Massachusetts' 440K number.
Yeah, frankly, I would even have expected Massachusetts to do more back then, because it was the first in the region to go to full recreational sales. You compared to last year's recreational openings, New Mexico and New Jersey both did 1.9 million on their first days. New Jersey's obviously a state of 9 million people, but New Mexico has less than 3 million people. I think I can't fully explain Massachusetts and why they didn't have a huge amount of sales on their first day. I think that John brought up a couple really good points, which is, availability of product, the number of dispensaries that are present. When you think about New Jersey, you've got all of the cross-border traffic from Pennsylvania, especially Philadelphia, coming into the state. You've got a lot of universities with graduate students, and millennials and Gen Z are statistically much more likely to use cannabis, even though one of the largest growing markets in the United States is boomers. But New Mexico, what? Sorry,
Boomers.
Yeah, the boomers are getting on the weed train. But one of the things I think that you have to take into consideration with Connecticut is that you guys are a small state. It doesn't take a lot of time to travel out of your state and into other places where cannabis is legal. So if people already have relationships with, a shop owner in Massachusetts, or a guy or a gray market shop owner in New York City, even though, full on recreational legal sales have not started there yet, it's pretty easy to get weed in New York. People are often going to stick with that for a while. There's a product they like John pointed out, there's not, as much product availability in Connecticut. And then the last thing to think about is cost. So if Connecticut wants to get people to come to Connecticut, they're going to need to have better weed and cheaper weed than everyone else around them in order to punt those sales higher, which is something that's happened before. But unfortunately for Connecticut, they are legalizing not in a bubble or in a vacuum like a lot of states have, where they're legalizing, Colorado was surrounded by all illegal states when they legalized, and they still are.
Natalie, what's
coming because of it's the only place that's available.
What's the deal with the tax revenues in Connecticut? Our lieutenant governor says that we're competitive. I think it's around 20% when you factor in all the taxes. We have a 6% revenue tax or state sales tax, and then there's about 14% of total other taxes. The state says some of that goes back to the community. What are your thoughts on our tax level?
I mean, I think that's pretty in line with a lot of other places. You see people even in like from Oregon to Washington, they're both legal states with a lot of products, but Washington has slightly lower taxes. And people who live in that border region, they're not going to drive an hour, but they'll drive 15 minutes to not pay taxes. So at all. Right. So that can make even the slightest differences. Like if being competitive versus being the cheapest can make a pretty big difference. But one of the things that I think is forgotten is the licensing fees for the producers, because those fees are also passed on to the consumers in the actual cost of the marijuana. So this was California's problem. They have a really high barrier to entry for growers and distributors. They have to pay a lot of money up front. They have to pay a lot for their licenses. And so there's no way that they can undercut the illicit market in California that doesn't have to pay those fees. And they've really, really struggled since they legalized now more than 5 years ago.
Get your weed in Connecticut in Brantford. Also, you can get it in New Haven at a store. There's also online shops for each of these places. Meriden, Newington, also Willimantic as well. 7 places so far that are open for business, and 2 to follow that have also been licensed that are not ready yet in Torrington and Danbury. Also, Montville is one of those towns that's ready to go as well. Speaking of these 9 dispensaries that are currently licensed to sell pot for recreational use, more will follow. To come are partnerships the state has put in place to promote social equity. We have a friend on Twitter asking us to dig into equity, asking, please talk about this. Willimantic has been hit hard by the war on drugs. Why is it so important to have a social equity conversation, Natalie, when we talk about marijuana and cannabis?
Yeah, I think this is a really big part of the conversation because, in the words of many, many people I have spoken to, why would you legalize something that has been used to put Black and brown people disproportionately behind bars for almost 80 years, and yet then let predominantly white business owners make money off of it, which we see a lot is happening. One of the biggest hurdles that I've watched states go through over and over again with equity is what I was talking about before, which is that cannabis exists as a business within the larger structure of American capitalism and American business. And you hit a lot of hurdles. Equity business owners oftentimes are going to hit more hurdles. If they've had a criminal justice record, they may not have been able to gain the necessary business experience that's going to, elevate. I've talked to people that are like, well, I was in real estate for 20 years in Orange County, and now I opened a cannabis dispensary. And that's just a level of privilege that a lot of the equity applicants don't have, and connections into capital, venture capital, connections with, zoning boards and city councils, and all of those relationships that make it easier to open and operate a business in any given place. Those are part of the inequities that exist in the larger business world in the United States of America that people of color and people with records already have to navigate and are not able to navigate as easily as people with privilege, who are often white people. And so that's something that a lot of equity programs are hitting and needing and have to deal with. And it'll be really interesting to see how Connecticut deals with that in their program.
And it's not just distribution as well. And John, I'll let you get in here in a second, but it's not just distribution as well. It's also connecting people of color to jobs in production as well, growing the pot and cannabis here going in hand. Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, that's something that Connecticut is doing also intentionally that I think other states haven't as much, where they have partnerships where other states have just looked at the licenses for growing or for dispensaries as the equity product. And, a lot of people said, hey, we just want jobs in the industry. Like, we don't want to have the whole pressure of starting a small business on our own. We just want a job. How do we do that? And so that's something new that Connecticut's doing that I'm interested to watch.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, and Frankie, one of the ironic things is that the social equity aspect of this has ironically sort of made it harder for people that it was designed to help to get into the industry. The reason I say that, there's so much paperwork and so many requirements to prove that you are a legitimate social equity applicant and that you are not a front for a larger multi-state operator. We interviewed an attorney last week who has represented a lot of the applicants in the Connecticut selection process. And, the just amount of paperwork that you have to submit and forms and verification, like Natalie mentioned, people who are trying to get into this from the social equity standpoint, that's a lot for someone with an MBA. Much less someone who, has never had much business experience. And so on one hand, I think the state is making an earnest attempt to, make this as level a playing field as they can. But on the other hand, the ironic thing is that it's sort of turned into a barrier to entry for a lot of social equity applicants.
To the point of why the state probably should do this, if you look at the website that the state has set up, they have like a cannabis portal on the state website that will show you pockets of Connecticut, cities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And it's really stark because you're seeing a lot of the dots in these cities. The cannabis convictions we were talking about in segment 1, 11% of those convictions that were erased happened in Hartford. So far, the state really to come up with partnerships they've put in place to promote social equity. They've had this Cannabis Social Equity Council, and they've greenlit 5 joint ventures and rejected 9 requests. Something else I want to talk about, the accountability project that we have here at Connecticut Public, or TAP as we call them, recently traced the history of the state's most well-established cannabis businesses, examining whether they fulfilled plans made during the licensing process to give back to their communities. This is something I want you to react to, Natalie, if you can. They found, TAP, our team, found that 35 businesses expecting donations never got a dime.
Yeah, so I think that that's not totally unheard of in both government and cannabis. I'm just thinking of Colorado was when they legalized, they said, hey, our tax revenue is going to go to education, and sales began in January and money started going to schools in November. And then I remember eventually the Denver Post went back and checked up and said not all of the money is going to where they said the money was going to go to. So I think this is something that it's good to keep track of, in a larger political sense. Also, government does not always do the things that they say they're going to do, and they need local journalists to keep them accountable. So I'm glad you guys are doing that. It's really, really important. But, I think that it's sort of a time will tell thing of if these issues get wrinkled out, is how I would approach it, from sort of watching other states go through this bumpy roller coaster of legalization and getting all of the kinks sorted out.
Oh, thank you so much for talking about what local reporters need to do in this coverage. We can't do it if it weren't for individuals like you, Natalie, covering this for the last, at least in terms of pot rollouts for the last 5-6 years that have been happening. So thank you so much for your work.
Well, I would honestly say the complete turnaround also, which is that, national news organizations, I've worked in local news before this, and we exist on the backs of local reporters and local news organizations, especially with something like cannabis, because there's a lot of things that we can't keep track of that we know because the Connecticut Mirror or Connecticut Public Radio or local TV stations are uncovering and looking at. And then we can draw the dots to say, hey, this is happening in many states, or hey, federal government, are you doing something about this? So
thank you so much, Natalie. So much. And John Craven's going to stay with us, but we're so sad to say goodbye to Natalie Ferdig, federal cannabis policy reporter for Politico. Thank you so much for joining Where We Live today.
Thanks so much for having me.
John Craven, stay with me. Listeners, you're tuned in to Where We Live on Connecticut Public. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. On Fridays on Connecticut Public, it's Frankie and Johnny. My pal John Henry Smith joins me on the show. But today on Where We Live, it's Frankie and Johnny Craven. You like that?
How can you cheat on me with another John? I thought I was the only John in your life.
You know, these days with the economy, what it is, and things are where there is, sometimes cheaters got to cheat.
It's funny that we're doing this on the radio, because when we go out on stories, I mean, it's just like this, you and me. So it's nice to do this and let people listen in.
Oh, my God. So happy to be joined by you. And if people want to ask us a question about a bill, or maybe they want to talk politics with Frankie and Johnny Craven here, they can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. And you dug through more than like 100 new bills set to hit the floor this session. Maybe they'll hit the floor. We'll see. What did you find related to marijuana?
Okay, so there are a couple of things that would tweak the cannabis law. We were talking about fairness and equity, right? And one of the big complaints we heard, this was a big loophole in the cannabis law. I really think they should have anticipated this, but with all the things that you have to try to anticipate with a law like that, I can't give them too much grief for missing it. But when they created the social equity lottery, they didn't put any sort of cap on how many times someone could apply. So think about it like playing the Connecticut lottery. The more tickets you buy, the better chance you have of winning. So
how much that ticket cost?
Right. Well,
$300,000 or $3 million. Well, I forget what the number is to enter for a license.
No, the lottery slots were cheaper. I think they were a couple $100, maybe $1,000.
Ah, okay, gotcha.
It was $3 million to convert to to a hybrid growing operation if you were already growing medical pot.
Yes, there you go. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a lot of numbers to keep track of, and I'm not always great at it. But yeah, whatever the number was, I think mom and pop groups could maybe afford to put 5, 6, 7 applications in for the lottery. But if you had access to a big multi-state operator like INSA up in Massachusetts, they could bankroll hundreds of lottery applications. And so some people got selected for the lottery who, were just had access to that kind of money. And so one of the things that they're looking at doing is either putting a cap on future lottery applications or raising the application fee. So the more applications you put in, the more you have to pay. I don't know if that will necessarily address the big money issue. It might just invite bigger money, but it's one of the ideas out there. Also talking about fairness, it's very hard to get into this business, not just because of the paperwork, but access to like capital, right? I mean, banks can't lend to you generally because this is illegal at the federal level. So Jason Rojas, who is the House Democrats leader, has filed a bill to give cannabis businesses certain tax write-offs for business expenses that might not normally be tax write-offs. So it's things like that, I think, that you're going to see this time. And then on the other side, the Republicans are trying to put the brakes on this. They've actually filed a bill that would suspend retail sales altogether until a number of conditions are met, one of which would be that police departments are fully staffed on what are called drug recognition experts. This is law enforcement's best attempt to do a sobriety test, if you will, for high drivers, where no such tests really exist. But it's a series of cognitive tests that a specially trained police officer can do.
A drug recognition expert.
Yeah. And so, part of the cannabis law was that, the police had to staff up on these DREs. And I'm not exactly sure how far along they are in that process. But the Republicans in this bill want to pump the brakes on the retail sales until those numbers come up.
To me, it kind of sounds like with police reform, where several things came up that were really an opportunity to try to reverse the whole thing. And it sounds like that's what's happening with public safety. Now, John Craven, I say we only got about 3 minutes left in the program. So do you mind if we whip around just a little bit to get some kind of new news out there?
Yeah. What do you want to know?
I want to know, first of all, I had you dig through a bunch of bills here. You were going to do that anyway. I heard that this session's going to rock.
I swear I've gotten more response to this tweet, I think, than anything I've put out in years. There is a bill. I'm going to pull it up for you right now.
You better do it quick. We got a minute on this time.
Yeah. Okay. So somebody has filed a bill that would create criminal penalties for dismantling a stone wall. So Connecticut lawmakers are leaving no stone turned this year.
And hopefully they're not stonewalling either.
Hopefully they're not stoned.
Or stonios. Oh my God, that's stonios were one of those things that the Attorney General William Tong showcased to folks that were like these fake these businesses were, or these bad businesses, I guess, were putting out there to try to get kids to buy marijuana, and they were saying kids were eating it, and it was a real bad thing. Nonetheless, just really quickly, what about some items related to alcohol? I understand this may be a session where we talk about selling wine in grocery stores.
Yeah, I mean, forgive me for being skeptical, but I mean, this comes up so often, and I know the grocery stores are going to make a big push for it this year. They've done that in the past. We'll see what happens. I mean, the package store lobby is incredibly powerful in this state. I mean, Malloy tried to get rid of the bottle minimum price over and over again. They killed that. I mean, just getting Sunday sales was an uphill battle. So I don't know if I see it going anywhere, but I might be proven wrong.
And just really quickly, I think about 30 seconds or so left in the program, we now understand that there's going to be a special election to try and fill the seat in the 100th Assembly District for Quentin Williams. What can you tell me is the latest on trying to fill that seat and maybe a new committee assignment?
Yeah. So, I mean, he was in charge or co-chair of the powerful the Labor Committee, which, has been the driving force behind a number of major bills. They've replaced him on that committee, so they can now get down to work. As for, who's going to jump in the ring, we haven't heard any names officially yet, but I imagine there's going to be a lot of interest in Middletown. And
we know that Manny Sanchez is in on labor. John Craven, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for joining us on Where We Live. I'm Frankie Graziano. Today's show produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Hey, you can download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thanks for listening. This is Where We Live.